some more coming in, but I think we can start. Thank you.
Yeah. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, representatives of academia and civil society, ladies and gentlemen. We are delighted to welcome you to launch of the book authored by Robert R. King, az Emberi Jogok Lobogója Alatt, the Banner of Human Rights, and to hear the thought-provoking words of our guest speakers. This is a book we decided to publish after the very successful launch of the English language academic book we published with Brill in 2018. This too had the title, The Noble Banner of Human Rights, and this too celebrated and honored the achievements and indeed the larger-than-life character of Congressman Tom Lantos, widely known as a principal champion of democracy and human rights. Following the presentations on Tom Lantos's work and achievements at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, we received numerous feedbacks that, while very well known and appreciated in political circles, the interested Hungarian audience did not have any resources to find out more about Tom Lantos's work and indeed the type of person he was. Since Bob King, his former chief of staff for nearly 30 years, wrote a long chapter about Tom Lantos in the English language book, we asked him to complement this chapter with his personal recollections and his own work related to Central and Eastern Europe and more specifically Hungary. This way, the Hungarian book published and introduced now has extensive detail about Tom Lantos's work and life, as well as Bob King's, who, in addition to bringing the Hungarian crown back home, has been a distinguished diplomat and scholar. For instance, he used to be the Democratic Staff Director of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in the period of 2001 and 2009. And he authored minimum 5 books, more than 40 articles on international relations. Only this year, as far as I know, he published 2 books with the University of Stanford. So maybe, Bob, you'll have some time to talk about that as well. But we are also absolutely delighted to have among us 𝗥𝗶𝗰𝗵 𝗏, who is the president of our sister organization, the Lantos Foundation in the U.S., together with her husband, Ambassador 𝗟RH𝘁, who will also say a few words about Tom Lantos, not only as a fellow congressman for a time, but also as a son-in-law. And we are absolutely delighted to have Mr. Mark Dillard, we understand also a former academic, among us. And we would like to thank him to have joined us, but also to the U.S. Embassy for supporting this very important project, which is not only about a true champion and principled actor of human rights. I have to say we had people walking into our office from Africa and elsewhere asking us the question, is this that Tom Lantos, which we met sometimes, or he stood up for this, he stood up for that? Is this the one who knew the Dalai Lama and so on? We realized that people from abroad knew more about the activism of Tom Lantos globally than people in Hungary. So we are absolutely delighted to open this book launch with the contribution of Chargé d'Affaires, 𝗥𝗶𝗰𝗵. But without giving you the floor, I need to make some technical notes. After our guest speakers, attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions. To do so, we will ask you to use the raise hand function found at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And I would also like to remind all attendees that the event is being live streamed on YouTube and recorded. The link to the live stream will be shared in the Zoom chat. And now I am turning to Chargé d'Affaires, 𝗥𝗶𝗶𝗵, to deliver his speech. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I've learned, if I've learned anything in the last year and a half, it's to ask people to make sure that you can hear me. Did I properly get the mute button off? Yes, I see nods. So let me say good evening. I'm honored to be part of this incredible group of people and to be invited to be part of this special event. And on behalf of the U.S. Embassy here in Budapest, I want to congratulate Robert King, the Tom Lantos Institute, and the entire Lantos family on this remarkable accomplishment. This year has been a very, very interesting year in the embassy because in 2021, we have been celebrating 100 years of formal diplomatic relations between the United States and Hungary. And of course, that relationship between our countries goes beyond the official aspects, the aspects that we're working on every day in the diplomatic corps, from kind of military and scientific cooperation to the work that Hollywood does in Budapest, to the economic and trade ties that are going on. And we have many aspects like this that we have and continue to celebrate in the relationship. And I can't think of a better way to add to this list of important accomplishments than to recognize one of Hungary's and America's best. That would be Congressman Tom Lantos. The Congressman truly represented the best of the United States and the best of Hungary and the best of humanity. His life adds, I think we could say, to the great Hungarian tradition of Hungarian-born freedom fighters. And what truly made his fight for freedom special was his tireless advocacy for the rights of the powerless and the voiceless around the world. As it's well known, he was the only Holocaust survivor to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. The congressman approached his advocacy for human rights with an urgency and passion that's, I think it's inspiring to me. I think it's inspiring to all of us. This is grounded in the experiences of his life and his intellectual efforts. And so throughout this lifelong effort, he modeled how we can work across parties, how we can work across backgrounds, across borders, I'll quote him, to, as he put it, take the noble banner of human rights to every corner of the world. So now what we see, and one of the reasons I'm so excited to be part of this, is we see the institutions that bear his name continue to carry on that legacy. So it's my hope that those who read the noble banner of human rights will follow the spirit of Congressman Lantos, bringing human rights advocacy into the next generation. So with that, let me say thank you for the chance to say a few words, and once again, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dillard. And now I will turn to Mr. King to introduce the book he authored. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna Maria. Let me also say right at the beginning how much I appreciate the invitation from the Tom Lantos Institute to write the chapter about Tom Lantos that is now being expanded and published separately in Hungarian. Working with Tom Lantos on Capitol Hill with the U.S. Congress for 25 years was one of the great experiences of my life. And being forced to sit down, think about it, and write about it has been a very good experience. I've enjoyed very much thinking back over what it was that made Tom unique, that made him different, and that continues to be important in terms of his legacy. Tom was unusual in that most members of Congress are like Richard Sweat. They're Americans, they're born in the United States, they're raised in the United States. Tom Lantos was unusual. There are other members of Congress who were not born here in the United States who became members of Congress, and Tom was in that situation. He decided to run for Congress only later in life. He had a full career as a professor, as an academician, and he was very active and involved in politics. And it was important that he actually became the member of Congress. Looking at American congressmen, it takes a person with a split personality to do the job. On one hand, you are representative of a particular group of people, a particular area, a particular territory, and your primary concern to be reelected and is to represent them and their interests. At the same time, you're in Washington and you're asked to vote, to participate, to discuss, to make decisions on issues that cover a broad range of topics. And in many cases, the issues that you deal with and what you're forced to do as a member of Congress may be contrary to what the interests of your own constituents are. And this balance between representing a small group of constituents and representing the broader interests of the United States is something that takes a real person to figure out how you do it. Tom did it well. It's interesting, there are two principal things that are named after Tom, and they reflect this bifurcation of the responsibility. There is a tunnel on the Pacific Coast Highway just south of San Francisco, right in Tom Lantos's congressional district. And it was not there when Tom was first elected to Congress. Periodic landslides caused the road to slough into the Pacific Ocean, and the highway would be closed for months at a time. When I first met Tom Lantos, the first thing I did was go to California, and we had hearings and meetings and discussions about how we were going to deal with this highway that was continually slipping into the Pacific Ocean. They finally decided the best solution is a tunnel. They built the tunnel. It took 20 years to get the tunnel to the point where they were actually building it. The Tom Lantos tunnels are the memorial to Tom in his congressional district. The tunnel was finally completed after his death, but it certainly was one of the things that he spent a lot of time focusing on. The second thing is, when you get to Washington, how do you carve out an area of concern, and how do you establish a reputation in Washington when you're dealing with other congressmen, when you have other responsibilities to do? Well, for Tom Lantos, that was human rights. Tom Lantos loved foreign policy. He loved traveling. He traveled extensively before he was a member of Congress, and as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, he traveled when he was a member of Congress. But his real focus in foreign policy was on human rights and the rule of law and the principles that ought to guide in terms of what's happening. And so for Tom, the human rights issue became the real issue where he made his name. There were a number of organizations. Members of Congress get together, they have common interests, they create an institution, a caucus, some organization that focuses on a particular issue. And there were issues that were concerned about ethnic Albanians. There were groups that were concerned, groups of Congress who were concerned about treatment of Jews in the Soviet Union at that time. There were others who were concerned about the treatment of the Roma, the Gypsies. Tom Lantos was approached by another member of Congress who said, let's create one of these organizations to focus on the problem of Jews in the Soviet Union, because that was a real problem at the time. Tom said, no, I don't think we should do that. I think we need to focus on human rights. And we ought to focus on the problem of treatment of Jews in the Soviet Union, but we ought to treat all of these other issues as well. And so Tom Lantos and John Porter of Illinois put together the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. And that became the organization that took on all of the human rights issues around the world and gave attention and focus to those issues. After Tom passed away, one of the first things the Congress did was to elevate the Human Rights Caucus to an official body of the House of Representatives. And it was named the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. And that continues to function. His legacy continues now, approaching 20 years since his death. And that's one of the places where the human rights issues really are hashed out. And so it's significant that Tom has that interest in terms of broadening the scope. One of the motto of the Human Rights Caucus is that human rights are indivisible. And I think that was an important contribution that Tom made in terms of how the Congress deals with these issues of human rights and of foreign policy. The one thing that was of particular interest to Tom, and there are all kinds of stories that I'd love to tell. We don't have time to do it. Recommend the book. There are a lot of good stories in the book about Tom Lantos and what he did. But one of the things that I remember most about Tom was December 1989. December 1989 was just as the Berlin Wall came down, as Central Europe, Eastern Europe at the time, was going through a transformation. Tom Lantos decided in December that he was going to go to Central Europe and see what was going on. The Berlin Wall had come down on the 9th of November. He told the deputy leader of the House of Representatives that he was going on this trip. Richard Gebhardt of Missouri, congressman from Missouri. And Tom said, it's going to be an interesting time. Interesting things are going on. As Tom said, Gebhardt suddenly became very interested, and Gebhardt decided to join Tom on this trip. We were able to make some very significant visits while we were here. First thing we did is go to Berlin. We saw the wall come down. We met with what was left of the East German government. Walter Honecker was long since gone, but there were some people who were in positions and they were trying to figure out what do we do with the future of this. We were there at the time that the Soviet Union had called for a meeting of the four powers that were set up after World War II to regulate the affairs of Berlin. The Soviets were quite concerned about what was going on. And the Secretary of State, Jim Baker, was in Berlin and gave his well-known speech. We were there for all of those occasions. We went back and forth between East and West Germany, East and West Berlin. All of these things, as these events were happening, we were there on the 1-month anniversary of the opening of the wall. And we went to what is now called Potsdamer, well, I guess it was called that then, Potsdamer Platz. The wall went right through the middle of Potsdamer Platz. And we were there at night as they began the process of removing the concrete slabs that had been placed through the middle of Potsdamer Platz. From Berlin, we went to Warsaw. Warsaw was in a state of suspended animation because they were having an election. And in this election, the Communist Party was roundly defeated. We met with a number of Polish officials talking about what was going on, what the future might bring, and the uncertainty that everybody was facing. From there, we went to Prague. We had one of the most interesting meetings with the foreign minister of Czechoslovakia. It was one country in those days. The foreign minister had just been appointed. Václav Havel had not yet been named president of the Czech Republic, but the foreign minister, 𝗟̀Rhy had been, he told us during the course of the meeting with him, that morning he had, before he came to the foreign ministry, he had to stoke the furnace in an apartment building where his previous job had been caretaker of the apartment building. Because of the change that had taken place, this intellectual and foreign policy specialist was now the foreign minister of Czechoslovakia. From there, we went, well, actually, as we were going to the opera that night in Prague, we drove up to the opera house, which is right at the head of Wenceslas Square. Students were out in mass in the square shouting, "Havel to the castle, Havel to the castle." So Gebhardt and Tom Lantos got out and joined the students and marched through the Wenceslas Square to call for Havel to be appointed president. From there, we went to Budapest. Budapest is always Tom's favorite place, and he was so excited to be in Budapest as the changes were taking place there. We had interesting meetings with a number of leaders. We had a dinner at the Chargé d'Affaires residence while we were there. This was at a time when Mark Palmer, who was then ambassador, had been assigned another position, and his successor was not yet there. The dinner included the daughter of Julia Ilyes, excuse my Hungarian pronunciation, very well known, one of the most prominent Hungarian intellectuals. The other person that was at the dinner that was an interesting person was József Antal. Antal was the first democratically chosen leader of Hungary after the succession. Antal at the time was still the head of the museum and the library for the, I forget his name, the man who discovered the germ theory of medicine. And Antal, who became the leader of Hungary for the first 3 years of the free Hungary, and Tom had a lengthy conversation about what was going on. The next morning, we left Budapest to return to Washington. As we were on the way to the airport, the cab driver said to us as we were traveling along, "We don't know what's going on, but last night in Timișoara, in the city, Romanian city, but ethnically Hungarian, there were reports that riots were taking place." This was the beginning of the revolution in Hungary that resulted in the overthrow and death of Ceausescu. And this was happening as we were getting on the plane to come back to Washington. Tom was never more excited about what was going on in Hungary and in Central Europe than he was as we went through the experience of that trip. But the one thing that Tom was also concerned about is making sure that the changes that were taking place continued in a positive direction. And he became very involved in legislation to provide assistance to the countries of Central Europe as they were going through this transition, and to provide American involvement and American help when we could do some of the things that we needed to do. One of the things that I want to make in a quick closing comment about Tom Lantos is how good he was as a speaker and how he was able to express himself so well. Tom Lantos always had staff write him speeches. I remember the one that I remember the most was the speech when the Dalai Lama was given the Congressional Gold Medal. This is the highest award that the United States Congress can present. And the decision was made to present it to the Dalai Lama, which Tom was very much involved in doing. Tom had a special relationship with the Tibetan religious leader, and the two of them got along extremely well. In 1989, about the same time the events we talked about in Central Europe, the Dalai Lama came to Washington, his first visit. George H.W. Bush was president at the time, and the Dalai Lama was coming to Washington, first time ever. White House would not receive him. The Chinese were not happy about the Dalai Lama being there. So Tom Lantos decided that the Dalai Lama needed to be received by the Congress. He asked the Speaker, he asked various other members of Congress to participate in some kind of an event for the Dalai Lama. The Speaker said, the State Department says don't do it, we're not really going to do it. So Tom Lantos and a handful of members of the Human Rights Caucus met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in a congressional hearing room. Tom met the Dalai Lama as he arrived in a cab outside the Longworth House office building. The two of them developed a relationship that blossomed after that. And in October of 2007, one of the last major events that Tom Lantos participated in before his death a few months later was the ceremony when the Dalai Lama was presented with the Congressional Gold Medal. And Tom asked staff, please, give me I've only got 5 minutes. It's an important speech. I want a really good speech. So staff slaved over this speech for 2 or 3 weeks. Beautiful speech. They worked on it. We went through it. Tom Lantos read it the morning that he was supposed to speak and threw it in the garbage can, literally threw it in the trash can. And then he got up at the event and gave the absolute finest speech that was given on that occasion. And this was the way Tom Lantos functioned. He had such a feeling, a commitment, an understanding that he could express himself so. And the thing that's ironic in all of this is that Tom Lantos, to his dying day, spoke with a very, very thick Hungarian accent. In fact, when Tom was posthumously presented with the the Presidential Medal of Freedom, George W. Bush made a comment about Tom's Hungarian accent, and everyone in the East Room of the White House roared at his comment because that was the distinctive. You knew Tom Lantos's voice from that accent, but he made a difference, and what he said and the speeches that he gave were incredibly good. I've gone way over my time, Anna Maria. There are some really good stories in this book, and I encourage all of you to read the accounts of some of the things that Tom did. But thank you very much for the opportunity of doing this and of being able to talk about Tom and some of the things that he did. Thanks.
We thank you, Bob, for putting all these stories down, of which we heard one. And it was so nice to take of you to take us back to the moments of change in Central and Eastern Europe, and that hope we had back then that this would be a better world. And things haven't gone the ways we sometimes would have liked. and we can say that there are things we would have liked to see going differently, but the hope and the trust and the commitment that change can happen has to be there. And Tom Lantos is a figure who instills and reinforces this commitment to democratic values and the rights of all humans, as you pointed out. So you see, you make me so excited. I am engaging in a talk and I shouldn't. But going back, I just wanted to mention that your book was translated by 𝗏𝗏 and we are very grateful to the translator that she did such a good job. And we are also very grateful to 𝗥𝗶𝗰𝗵𝗿, who was the editor of the book, and also to Nikki, who undertook the very busy job of the managing editor. And after this, I will turn to Katrina Lantos.
Well, it is such a pleasure to be with all of you today. Needless to say, both my husband and I wish we could be with you in person, not only the panelists, but those of you listening online. And we hope that perhaps in the spring we'll have the opportunity to meet in person. But I want to express my gratitude to the Tom Lantos Institute and to all of those who have made possible the publication of this book and this gathering today. I loved listening to Ambassador King's recollections. I remember that time in the world's life and in the life of my father, and in fact, how deeply thrilled and filled with optimism he was to see freedom and change and democracy coming to a region of the world, and especially to his beloved Hungary. And as you say, Anna Maria, sometimes it's been 2 steps forward and a step back, and the progress has not been utterly smooth and uncontested. But still, as we look back at the vast difference before the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when communism as an ideology that kept this region of the world held back and constrained and really imprisoned, and now the world we are in, we can still see that enormous progress has been made. I think I have to say that destiny certainly brought my father, Tom Lantos, and Dr. Bob King together, because my father was a passionate Hungarian. There was no American more patriotic than Tom Lantos. He often referred to himself as an American by choice. And when he passed away, it was so moving to hear the tributes of his many colleagues who said, really, there has rarely been in our history a man of greater patriotism, passion, and love for the United States. But what I think was very special was that despite the suffering of his youth, despite the terrible things he had witnessed as a young boy in Hungary, he never lost a deep passion for the land of his birth. He was a son of Hungary till the day he died. And I think that it was in some ways, especially as he got older, a mutual love affair. And how wonderful it was that his dear colleague, Bob King, should have had his own very special connection to Hungary when he played a central role in bringing the beloved crown of St. Stephen back to Hungary. And so they had a common bond there, and that common bond, that common terra, shared ground that they occupied was a love and a respect for Hungary, which is, and I was always taught by my father as a child growing up, was a remarkable place, a remarkable people that despite millennia surrounded by groups of different languages, different ethnicities, and all sorts of warring contentions against all odds, managed to retain its distinct identity, its linguistic and cultural and musical heritage that is unlike anything else in the world. And so I know it would mean so much to my late father to have this wonderful book with the marvelous biographical chapter by Dr. King, now available to the people of Hungary to read in their own language. I think, and Dr. King alluded to this, my father was undoubtedly a brilliant individual, a brilliant strategic theorist. And he understood the world of geopolitics, and he understood the world of realpolitik. But what set him apart from so many of the other very brilliant minds that he worked alongside and individuals who he collaborated with was that my father, no doubt in large measure because of the experiences of his childhood and his youth as a Holocaust survivor, always understood that geopolitics separated from a moral compass and a moral conscience can very easily degenerate into little more than a struggle of the survival of the most powerful, the survival of the fittest, you know, and a default of might somehow equating with right. And he understood to the depths of his being how wrong this was, and that power, whether it is military, whether it is economic, whether it is political or diplomatic, must be profoundly tethered to principles, to values, and to conscience. And the most important component of those principles must be the recognition of our fundamental human rights. You know, I have the opportunity to teach a course on human rights and American foreign policy at Tufts University. And one of the key points that I want my students always to take away from the course is that the essential organizing principle of the entire modern human rights movement is the recognition of the inherent dignity of each individual. And that inherent dignity, their inherent worth, and that bundle of rights embodied in the Universal Declaration cannot be set aside or trampled upon or ignored in the pursuit of larger geopolitical considerations. And so how grateful I am for the existence of the Tom Lantos Institute, for the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the Congress, for the work of the Lantos Foundation that I lead, which seeks each of these organizations in their own way to make sure that the centrality of human rights is not forgotten and remains uppermost in the work that we are doing among nations. Now, the title of the book, whose launch we celebrate today, is The Noble Banner of Human Rights. And what does it mean to lift a banner? Well, it means a few things. First of all, it means to lead, often leading into battle. It means to inspire. And we think of a banner also as something that people rally around. When a banner is lifted up, it draws people to it, to rally them to a cause. And I think all of those meanings of that idea of a noble banner of human rights really exemplified the way my father lived his life. He absolutely was a leader when it came to human rights. He had, as Bob said, with his eloquence and his charisma and his passion and his charming and distinguished Hungarian accent, he had the ability to inspire people, but he also rallied people. I think he took as his exemplar in that regard the great Swedish humanitarian Raoul Wallenberg, who in the depths of the worst time for the Jews of Hungary, not only put his own life on the line to save innocent Jewish lives, including both of my parents, but rallied others within the diplomatic community to that cause, and thereby extended and amplified his own ability to do good. So when I think of the book, and when I think of the idea of the noble banner, I think of those three dimensions: to lead, to inspire, and to rally. And I hope for those listening today that as you read the book, as you learn more about the life of Tom Lantos, that you too will rally to the work of organizations like the TLI, of good people to be found everywhere, and there are so many of them in Hungary, who have put themselves forth in the fight for the human rights of all people. I don't want to take too much time, and so I could go on and on, but I think I'd like to close with one of my favorite rabbi stories. My father loved to tell stories, and really the best, wittiest, and most insightful stories in the world, in my humble opinion, tend to come from rabbis. So here goes. There was a distinguished rabbi who gathered his students together, and he said, I have a question for you. How can a person know the precise moment when the night has turned to day? Well, one student raised his hand and he said, Rabbi, is it when a man walking through the woods at night, seeing an animal coming towards him, can distinguish between a wolf and a dog? And the rabbi said, nope, that's not the moment. And another student said, well, Rabbi, is it the moment when a man walking through the village back in the darkness can distinguish the outline of his house from the outline of his neighbor's house? And the rabbi said, no, that is not the moment. And then the rabbi said, I'll tell you, the moment you know that the night has turned to day is when someone walking down the street sees a stranger approaching and in his face recognizes the face of his brother. And I think that my father loved that story and lived by that story. He saw strangers in need, whether they were the Tibetans, whether they were the persecuted communities in every corner of the world. He didn't see them as strangers when they approached him, when they came to his office. He saw in their faces the faces of his brothers and sisters. And that's a wonderful example to me. It's an example we try to live by every day at the Lantos Foundation, to recognize that we are our brothers and sisters keepers. So thank you for inviting me to say a few words.
Thank you very much for pointing out the essential legacy we will remember of Tom Lantos. Indeed, he was one of the few persons who could transpose the particular into the universal. He could come through as a man who always maintained his particular roots and identities, yet he could speak to a universal audience. He was an amazing person in that way. And now I am giving the floor to Ambassador Richard Sweat.
Well, thank you very much, Anna Maria. And I first have to say I am very, very honored to be able to join this august group. I think this is the first time as the son-in-law of Tom Lantos I've ever had an opportunity to reflect upon my relationship with him. Somehow I think people either worry that son-in-laws don't have very good things to say, or that there's that for whatever reason they are never considered a certain kind of good resource. But I have lived with Tom, and I've spent much of my adult life with him, and his wife, my mother-in-law, lives with us now. So I have nothing but wonderful experiences to share. But I will say that when I first met him back in 1977, I met a man, as Katrina says, of towering intellect. And I, having grown up in the backwoods of New Hampshire, was always taught not to be too impressed by anything. And when I first met Tom, I couldn't help but be impressed. And he was certainly an intellect to be dealt with, far greater than mine, I had to admit right from the get-go. But I also have to say that early on in those early days of our relationship, the person who I also found to be incredibly important was his wife, Annette. And my first experience with her was being in their household when she connected with President Carter about talking about the Raoul Wallenberg's whereabouts and whether he could be saved from the Gulag in the Soviet Union. And these are experiences, I think, that are important mentioning, because she was always at his side. She was always his muse to go out and do these things in human rights. Yes, of course, his life experience led him in that direction as well, but the two of them were inseparable. And I can remember having long conversations at the dinner table, talking about these important issues, and Annette always was playing an important role in that conversation. I had the great and distinct honor of serving with him on the Human Rights Caucus. It wasn't the Tom Lantos Commission at that time. I wish my career had extended to the point where I could have seen that happen, and maybe even become an important member of that commission. But we worked on the Human Rights Caucus, and he was always looking for ways to protect those who were disadvantaged in this world. And one of the groups that we spent a great deal of time with was the Albanian community. He traveled to Albania, and much as Bob said, he traveled to other places, and he was constantly welcoming these people into the Congress and getting them an opportunity to speak before Congress or before committees, so that their causes and the plight of their lives could be heard by the Congress, and then we members of Congress could act upon that and hopefully bring some kind of support to them that not only buoyed their spirits, but even offered them financial support that would enable them to accomplish the very difficult tasks that they had before him, and before them, I should say. As I said, I lived with him when I was in Congress in their spare bedroom in Washington. And I was quite young when I was in Congress. I was in my early 30s. And I used to enjoy coming home to the district and telling my constituents that I was in Washington, D.C., serving them, representing them, but under parental supervision. And everybody got a good laugh out of that. But anybody who knows Tom knew that he was a domineering parent. And I was often felt at times that I had to compete for his daughter, not with her, but with him, because he was so dedicated to his family. And that was something that I came to really appreciate. I didn't like it at first, but I came to appreciate it because he was not only dedicated to these causes, but more specifically, he showed that in his life, in his own family. And the dedication that he gave to them was always inspiring to me. One of the things I think in the short amount of time, and I'm really happy that we might have an opportunity to come back to Budapest in the spring, because then you'll get the full son-in-law report. And I think all the details that are much more interesting than I can give right now will come out. But I think the one thing that I think of Tom when I think about him and his human rights work is that he was really one of the first responders before first responders became a term. I can remember when these things were happening, whether the wall was coming down or Bob's stories that he talked about with Tom were happening, or later on when other terrible events were happening in the Middle East, he and his wife would pack up and they would go into the fray. They were not running away from the fray. And this whole term now of first responders, you know, ever since 9/11, this is such an honorific term, of course, for the things that people do today. But Tom, I think, was an exceptional example of someone who really responded very quickly, not because he wanted the attention of going into some, you know, it was often he was never acknowledged by the press or by anybody that he was there. He was there to support the people who were enduring the attacks. And it was always so inspiring to me to see him take that time and to go into the fray and to be that kind of a person. Lastly, when I served as ambassador in Denmark, he used to visit us a lot because of the family and because he enjoyed being with his family so much. But I always learned from him when he was with me in meetings with my European colleagues. As Katrina said, he always talked about the fact that he was an American by choice. And through that choice, he also, what he had endured through the Holocaust and what he had seen happen in the world, during the Second World War, made him stand up to his European counterparts and remind them that not only were they supported and saved by the United States, they had an obligation to do the same and to pass it forward to those communities and those individuals and countries that were struggling in the same way that they had once struggled during the Second World War. And he was fearless in that respect. And I think the reason that he could do this, could be so hard on people, and yet retain their affection or at least their respect, was that in everything that I saw him do, he offered respect first and foremost. He respected people as human beings, he respected them as people, as individuals, and he gave them that element of humanity that when he put the real push on them, they felt obligated to fulfill his desires. And his desires were righteous, his desires were for the good, and he was giving them the opportunity to serve as he serves, not because they went through a Holocaust as he did, but because together they could agree no more Holocaust should ever occur again. And that to me was what I think I have taken away from my relationship with Tom, because he taught me that really if we could put respect out as the foundation upon which all the relationships around the world can be built, I think we would more successfully realize the peace that we all yearn for and that we all wish would happen. But it will never happen unless we take that Lantos aspect and apply it, which is respect for one another. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had yet another very inspiring contribution. You rarely see such a meeting where everyone is so pleased and enthused to talk about a person who was, it seems to me, a very coherent person. He had some integrity and coherence in him, which he could project and inspire with. We wish we had more of Tom Lantos's today. And now we're a little bit behind the time, but I saw Mr. 𝗏𝗏𝗿𝗁𝗍's hand up. So maybe we can give the floor to Mr. 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗁𝗍 now.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. Some technical mistake hindered me to join in the very beginning, so I missed 5 minutes at the beginning, but I realized great friends. And I would like to send my heartfelt very best wishes to the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗿 family, first of all. Katrina, my love to you. Dick, you are a wonderful person, and I miss you. The national prayer breakfast were cancelled, so we were not able to meet those time for 2 years at least. And Bob, if you recall me, I can always recall our time together. You and Tom, you were inseparable in a way, because whenever I visited him in the Congress, you were always there. So you and Elizabeth were part of the family, and most welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I will look for the book. I will read it, and I have to tell you that I had the privilege and the special occasion to meet several times with Tom. And just very briefly, because because of the time is very limited, and I did not count on joining to you, but I am very happy, and certainly it's a pleasure, an honor that we worked together with Tom on many occasions. And the Wallenberg statue in Budapest was a issue in which we came together, and it was a very special commitment to him that Ambassador Palmer was mobilized also. So that time I was in the Foreign Service, so it was a fantastic time. And the wonderful result is that the statue is there. The statue is well kept and highly respected. And I think it is noted by the people of Hungary and Budapest. This is certainly not all what Tom has done during his very wonderful career, but this is one thing which is here, and this always reminds me. And also it is very interesting that I was present at a meeting when he met the then Secretary General of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, Mr. Kádály, and they spoke Hungarian. And my role was only that sometimes I had to help Tom to find the right word, either in English or in Hungarian. So it was a historic moment to be involved. Sorry about that. I most welcome, heartfelt best wishes to all of you, and thank you, Maria, to connect me. I have the distinct honor to serve as the president of the supervisory committee of the Democratic Transition Foundation. This is a public foundation, and I was present at the very beginning of this, and under this public foundation, the Tom Lantos Institute is there, so I was always there when the establishment occurred. Thank you very much, and my very best wishes to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I am looking at the time, which sadly expired, and we can only say that we would really love you to come to Budapest in person, so that we can have a physical event when people can engage and dispute, discuss, and when we can contextualize more the Tom Lantos phenomenon and his legacy, because I think that's exactly what we need, that we hear the stories, his attitude, his direction, and we try to transpose that into solving our own dilemmas and ways forward at times which are complex, to say the least. So I would like to thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you for all the inspirational stories you have given us. We thank you for Bob again for authoring this fantastic book, and the Tom Lantos Institute will be happy to offer this book to you with great pleasure. And now I will have to close the meeting, thanking again for the U.S. Embassy, not only for being present and honoring the meeting with your presence, Mr. Dillard, but also for supporting financially this event, which we hope will not only be an online event, but it will be followed with physical discussions. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Viszontlátásra to everyone. Köszönjük nagyon szépen. Viszontlátásra.
És nagyon köszönjük.
We look forward to being there with you in person.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
And thank you for this wonderful event.
We are looking forward to it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
So-
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Just a quick practical announcement as I put it in the chat. For those of you who would like a printed copy, please get in touch with the TLI team either on phone or by email, or the electronic version of the book will be available from tomorrow on our website. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.